Hello, I'm Olivia Van Natta. Welcome to my thesis defense, From the Slime and Mud, Rumination as Fuel for Artistic Process. First, I'd like to say a big thank you to my committee, Chair Jason Burrell, Shannon Lindsay, Lane Wyatt, and Byron Clerks, who couldn't be here today. I'd also like to thank the UCF Gallery, particularly Shannon, Larry Cooper, Ryan Price, and Rihanna Horner. I would also like to thank all of the work study students. You're all awesome. Thank you so much. So today I will explain how I developed my own quantifiable creative framework to harness my inner emotional state through drawing and painting. My ultimate goal with this visual research was to fully incorporate emotional discomfort and negative emotion into my art practice. With that in mind, I'd like to set the stage with some important information before we get into a deeper analysis of my individual works. In alchemy, sublimation referred to a distillation process that enhanced qualities of a material beyond its original capability. This idea of elevated transformation has remained the same even as usage of the word has shifted. Eventually, the term was adopted into clinical psychology, where it's used in a variety of contexts. I define sublimation based on the definition used specifically in clinical art therapy. In art therapy, sublimation refers to the deliberate mind-body connection between inner emotion and outward physical action when making art. With this connection, difficult emotions cease to be perceived as a disruption or an obstacle because they are associated with a productive, rewarding outlet. These difficult emotions become an acceptable, understood part of life and can become part of an artist's toolkit. This is the emotional connection I pursued with my work in this program. Yayoi Kusama's lifelong art practice functions in this exact way. Kusama has lived with paranoid schizophrenia from a young age. As a child, she hallucinated overwhelming visions of swirling, moving polka dots, which caused her to become disconnected from her daily life. In her art, dots are symbols for her mental illness, but also symbols of energy and life. In the 1970s, after severe mental health struggles, she voluntarily checked herself into an institution in Japan where she discovered clinical art therapy, the structure with which she credits for saving her life. She still lives in the same institution, and her art studio is a short walk away around the corner. Sublimation is, at its root, connected to the notion of the sublime. The sublime is an ancient concept present in philosophy, spirituality, art history, and literature, and has many nuanced definitions and interpretations. All of these many definitions revolve around a notion of elevated greatness. In Kusama's infinity mirrored rooms, she is connecting with the idea of infinite expansion beyond human comprehension. In Kusama's installation, The Eternally Infinite Light of the Universe Illuminating the Quest for Truth, we again see her dot motif. She uses her personal language of dots to create a sublime environment for her viewers to physically step into, where they can experience an elevated version of Kusama's own polka dot hallucinations. This is the same ethos with which I've approached my recent body of work. I accomplish this through drawing and painting with a high level of detail that invites the viewer to become engrossed in the composition and to experience part of the same mental state I was in when creating these works. Infinity has a tendency to fill the mind with that sort of delightful horror, which is the most genuine effect and truest test of the sublime. Edmund Burke, 1757. Burke broke down the concept of the sublime into basic parts. He described it as a fear of emotional impacts. He described it as a series of emotional impacts with immediate physical reactions. He explained that the sublime is interconnected with passion, fear, and nervous tension, and that it can be physically felt as an emotion within the body. This relates specifically with my art practice as I work to connect with my own nervous tension while drawing and painting. The romantic sublime has been the version of this concept that I have gravitated toward most throughout my life. This iteration of the sublime is centered around human connection to nature. This can mean a positive and active connection as depicted in Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog, which is considered to be a classic example of the romantic sublime. This painting by Ivan Ivazovsky follows that romantic idea of living in peace with the natural world. The level of vibrancy is stunning and creates an idyllic ambiance, but also contains an underlying mysterious quality that seems to emanate from the natural scene itself. Ivazovsky accomplished this through a method of layering many thin glazes, especially when painting water. Because of his technique, the water seems to glow from within. I have admired Ayvazovsky's paintings for over a decade, and when I eventually began working in color in this program, I drew inspiration from this type of saturated palette and this idea of thin layers producing a luminous effect. In this scene, we see a ship at the mercy of choppy seas. This is the other side of the romantic sublime, powerful forces of nature against which humans have no recourse. This painting shows how both idyllic and threatening aspects of the sublime can be present at one time, which is a balance I like to play with in my own work. Like myself, Ayvazovsky did not work from observation. He worked from memory and imagination. He was able to work this way in part because he traveled extensively as the official painter of the Russian Navy. He internalized his travel experiences as a catalog of reference imagery in his mind. Similarly, my own visual language has been shaped by many of the places I've lived. When I was 4 years old, my family moved to Grenada, an island nation in the Caribbean. While we lived here, I would help my dad catch frogs in the jungles of the national park as part of his biology classes. Around age 8, I was introduced to the work of Japanese animator Hayao Miyazaki and his animation company Studio Ghibli. Princess Mononoke is a film about an immense magical forest. The film is done with traditional hand-drawn animation and gouache background paintings. As a child, the imagery in this film echoed my experience living in Grenada. Although the plot is magical, to me the story seemed relatable because of the legitimacy and connection I perceived with the environments. My mental library of reference images began to solidify. Also, I began to develop a deep sense of yearning for the natural world. When I was 12, we moved to the Big Island of Hawaii, where I've lived for a total of about 4 years, off and on. I developed a love for free diving on the reef. The abstract shapes of coral and aquatic plants have formed an integral part of my visual language. Later on, at age 25, I lived in the desert of Joshua Tree, California. The cacti were new to me and fascinating. In my mind, the desert landscape fits into that same abstract category as coral reefs. Around this time, I discovered Miyazaki's film Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind. The plot revolves around a poisonous jungle and the main character's ability to live in peace with it. The imagery in this film features spores, fungi, and giant insects. I had acquired a taste for this type of aesthetic. Most recently, I lived just 30 minutes away from the gorgeous Rainbow River here in Florida. I visited this river dozens of times during summer of 2022. I think that inundating my mind with this imagery in real life was the underlying force that pushed me to begin working in color during this MFA program. I felt I had an intuitive understanding of Hayao Miyazaki due to my own experiences living in places that resembled his scenery. But to understand aspects of Miyazaki's films that I may not have been aware of, I wanted to contextualize them amongst the canon of art history. In my research, I founded the article A Modern-Day Romantic, The Romantic Sublime in Hayao Miyazaki's Creative Philosophy by Dr. Brendan C. Walsh out of the University of Queensland. Contextualizing Miyazaki's work this way was the moment for me when the sublime went from being an interesting, traditional academic concept to something more tangible that I realized I had been experiencing and seeking for my entire life, both in real life and in art. I wanted to understand the ambiguity and nuance of the many definitions of the sublime, especially in relation to my own art and the art therapy concept of sublimation. Reading into the etymological origins of the word sublime, I found one fascinating dissection of its possible roots that struck me in context with my own art. Superlimas, a Latin derivative meaning above the slime or mud of this world, from James Beattie, 1783. This definition is where I've sourced the title of my thesis presentation and paper. I was struck by the phrase, above the slime or mud of this world, because I feel this wording reflects the subject matter of my recent body of work. I see this literally with plants growing in mud and a human figure emerging from slime, but also figuratively in terms of this artwork being done as an act of sublimation to transform difficult emotions. So taking those difficult emotions and rising above them. Through my earlier work in this program, you can trace the evolution that led me to my current approach. For the sake of brevity, I will only be covering the pieces included in this show, but working in graphite was my primary approach for 2 years of this program. My first major drawing was Florida 2020. In this piece, there is an emphasis on the natural world as well as layered detail. This is my largest graphite pencil drawing, and the scale can pull a viewer into a deeper level of observation as they follow small details through the composition. I worked with 0.5mm mechanical pencil and slowly built up the paper with minuscule hand-rendered marks for 2 months. I obsessed over making this to distract myself from my own tension and unaddressed emotions. By the end of it, I had developed signs of carpal tunnel syndrome. My pinky was actually completely numb for over a month, and I'm not exaggerating. My figural self-portrait at the center of this composition is contemplative and absorbed into a private mental world. That same emotional quality is expressed through this handling of graphite, specifically through the repetitive mark making and the rich, dark areas where the graphite has been applied in thicker layers. There's a level of repetition here to build up these surfaces. Although this piece is technically unfinished, I consider it to be complete in its incompleteness. This right-hand corner where my hatching fades away stands in stark contrast to the rich areas of heavy hatching filling the rest of the drawing. This mode of drawing and hatching has been a comfort zone to me since my teenage years. Junji Ito, a Japanese manga artist specializing in horror, was and still is a foundational influence for me. In his graphic novels, you can see those same qualities of layered hatching and richly established dark areas that I incorporate into my graphite drawings. The emotional tone of his stories is heightened by these creative choices. Similarly, I've always been mesmerized by the hatching and marks in etchings and engravings. Growing up with the works of Gustav Doré and Albrecht Dürer, I've always perceived the hatched aesthetic to possess a heavy emotional quality, which is added to by a grayscale palette. With that visible hatching, I am constantly reminded of the hand of the artist who made it. I have imitated the effect of etchings and engravings in my work because I wanted to recreate that visible hatching and leave behind evidence of my process. In Giovanni Piranesi's Carceri di Invenzioni, pictured here, one of a series of etchings, he creates dense environments meant to illustrate the prison of the mind. I discovered these etchings for the first time at the Norwegian National Gallery in September of 2022 and immediately connected with the immersive detail and the somber quality. In my series of small graphite drawings, Grenada 1997 stands out as a pivotal moment in my shift from abstractive narrative memory towards an approach emphasizing textures, process, and natural environments. Grenada 1997 is an abstracted memory of my childhood in Grenada. The mermaid resting in the bottom right corner represents a childhood obsession with merfolk, so in that way, I'm injecting a sense of nostalgia. The focus of this piece, much like Piranesi's Carceri in etchings, is the setting itself. The setting becomes an active character in its own right, and a viewer should be compelled to search within the composition for clues as to the deeper characterization of this place. With this piece, I reduced my emphasis on hatching and instead focused on developing small detail to fill the scene. Similar to Florida 2020, this drawing titled San Francisco 1993 depicts an abstracted memory, specifically my first memory of waking up alone in my bedroom. Every object in this scene has a symbolic meaning, and my use of graphite here is meant to invoke a somber, thoughtful space. I filled the room with delicately rendered line work that follows along the contours of the scene, mirroring the effects of etching and engraving, as I mentioned earlier. These lines filling the space create a sense of hidden energy pulsing within the interior. I wanted to create a quietness that was also somehow ominous or off-putting, mirroring the quality of my real memory. The line work on the floor seems to radiate from the child figure and gives a sense of loaded importance to the entire scene. San Francisco 1993 was my last graphite drawing. The truth is that the entire year leading up to that point, I had known in the back of my mind that I couldn't continue drawing the way that I had been. I had been resisting this due to my emotional connection with mechanical pencil. The pain in my wrist had worsened, and I was forced to take long breaks to heal. I knew that I had to expand my range of motions to reduce the pain. With this in mind, I began developing my method of drawing and painting with watercolor pencil. I view this as a reclaiming of my love of drawing after my painful experience with carpal tunnel symptoms. I felt the emotional weight of shifting into a new creative process. I felt compelled to establish a narrative for myself, a visual link between my graphite work and my new process. So I built a narrative device into the composition of my last graphite drawing as a way to bridge that gap. San Francisco 1993 is an abstracted memory, so within this abstracted memory, I placed an abstraction of my own subconscious in the form of a terrarium sitting on the bookshelf. Psychologically, framing this creative shift with narrative imagery instilled a strong motivation in me to create a work that felt like a truly genuine illustration of my subconscious. In combination with this, I felt supported by this program to pursue an unfamiliar way of working. In art therapy, holding space is the concept of a supportive environment that respects emotional awareness. I created this holding space for myself within the narrative confines of my terrarium, but also as a graduate art student, I felt it was almost my job to pursue this idea. Internal terrarium was my first practice in painting using my daily emotional state to inform my creative choices in the studio. I approached each day in the studio with the intention of releasing the precise physical sensation of my emotive state through my work. I worked on this painting consistently over 4 months. If I was in a positive mood, I would make bigger creative decisions and add to the composition. If I was in a neutral or negative mood of any kind, I would find a way to incorporate the specific physical feeling of that negative mood into my actions. I experience emotions as strong bodily sensations, so it became a matter of translating those sensations into a visual form that seemed to mirror what I felt. As I worked on Terrarium, this print of Florida Dream by Steve Lotz was hung up on the wall opposite me in the art studios. My obsession with this print grew as I worked on my own botanical scene. I completed my own painting without ever having seen the original version of this print, so imagine my surprise when I did see the original and I found that Lotz's color choices paralleled my own. Lotz and I are both connecting with the notion of the romantic sublime, but the title of his piece is also crucial here, Florida Dream. To me, Florida is a natural treasure. My time spent on Rainbow River altered me as a person. I believe the visual commonalities between Florida Dream and Internal Terrarium are linked to living among the natural beauty of Florida. Lotz channeled this intentionally as his piece was a commission for UCF. My gravitation toward this subject matter was less intentional, more subconscious, and was the result of trying to communicate my own emotional states as botanical forms. Biophilia is the notion of an instinctual bond that humans form with other species, including plants. Lotz's Florida Dream and my Internal Terrarium both contain a sense of biophilia within classic romantic parameters, specifically the saturated color palette, which expresses a sense of peaceful energy. It's extra appropriate to mention biologist Dr. E.O. Wilson, one of the preeminent scholars of the biophilia hypothesis, as there is actually a biophilia center dedicated to him in the Florida Panhandle. Biophilia can also refer to the human desire to actually become another animal or living thing. According to Dr. Drew Leader, it's part of human nature to intellectualize ourselves within the natural world and to intellectualize the natural world as a part of us. Speaking to this, Bernini's Apollo and Daphne sculpture depicts Daphne willingly transforming into a tree to escape Apollo's advances. Although there's a specific mythical narrative at play here, I think this sculpture still taps into that theme of earnestly desiring to occupy a non-human body. There are many reasons someone might consider this notion. In the 1966 film Fantastic Voyage, the inside of the human body is depicted as a lush botanical environment. The plot of this film has a team of scientists shrunk down to a microscopic size and injected into the body of a patient. They navigate internal anatomy in an attempt to locate a disease and cure it. I believe that by depicting these scenes with botanical imagery, the director was tapping into the notion of biophilia. This was a targeted decision to allow the viewers to feel more connected with the scenery rather than alienated by the true reality of internal human anatomy, which of course would not look anything like this. In this scene, unknown anatomical objects block the scientist's path. The scientists refer to this blockage as seaweed, further cementing the idea that they are traveling within a botanical space and not a human body. I relate this film to my own work in terms of the way I intellectualize my emotions as botanical forms. It was intuitive for me to frame my emotions this way. Botanical forms allow me to abstract my own emotional experience into something more acceptable to me. Flowers are free, natural beauties. Hardly anyone but a botanist knows what sort of thing a flower ought to be. and even they, though recognizing in the flower the reproductive organ of the plant, pay no regard to this natural purpose. Kant, 1878. This quote expresses the same line of thinking in terms of botanicals being abstract enough to allow for genuine emotional connection. In this case, the genuine emotional connection to abstract natural beauty. In my scenes, I've selected plants with distinct symbolic and personal meaning. Growing up in Southern California for several years, I saw Venus flytraps commodified and abused. They cannot survive in the climate of Southern California, yet are sold year-round as novelties for children. The flytraps wither and die after just a short amount of time. This was always devastating to me. As a child, I perceived them as close to sentient as a plant can be. This led me to depicting carnivorous plants in general. After beginning my work on internal terrarium, I discovered the history of Venus flytraps is tainted with cultural misogyny. The Western botanists who discovered the plant in the 1800s named it after women's genitalia. These botanists would use Victorian slang to joke about the plant and about women. These jokes are recorded in letters between the botanists, which are in turn recorded as part of history. In my work, Venus flytraps are a symbol for the type of pervasive misogyny that infects most traditional academic subjects, if you dig deep enough. At the start of this research, I was very resistant to accept my own daily emotional state. Up until this point in my life, I didn't prioritize emotional awareness beyond the desire to control my emotions. Studio time informed by a positive mindset felt natural and intuitive, but studio time informed by neutral or negative mood was difficult for me to navigate. And when I was unsure, I would freeze. I would sit and stare at my developing work, imagining all the possible ways I could add to it, yet I would remain frozen with indecision. My instincts were paralyzed. It was challenging for me to put a name to my mental experience at that time. Eventually, I realized that I was being controlled by my own obsessive rumination. Rumination is a kind of overthinking that shifts between a self-aware state and a complete lack of self-awareness. It's a back and forth cycle with repetitive thoughts about specific topics, as well as repetitive worry about the overall obsessive quality of these thoughts. When I began to read into clinical literature, I was pleasantly surprised to find that the deeper analysis of rumination laid out in clinical psychology completely lined up with the steps of my process that I had developed during internal terrarium and continued on in my other paintings. Clinically, rumination is broken down into several subcategories. Brooding and reflection are two different subcategories, but are really two sides of the same coin. Both are repetitive, difficult to stop, and can be exhausting. In this sequence of process photos from internal terrarium, you can get a clear idea of the type of physical action that I connect to the concept of brooding. I lock into the repetitive, mechanical action of filling an entire area or an entire composition with minuscule patterning that will likely be covered up later on in the process. In psychology, brooding is described as problem-focused rather than solution-focused. And I find it funny that by working this way, I'm actually generating more creative problems for myself, as I'm forcing myself to fill up a large area with very tiny marks. But I really do view this as an authentic connection with that sensation of brooding that I often feel. When I'm in that mindset, I don't want to solve creative problems. I actually do want to lock into an activity that matches my cognition and emotional state. Doing this removes that feeling from existing only inside of my body and places that feeling outside of myself, where it is contained within the image. A note on brooding. It's my opinion that in life, brooding is sometimes necessary despite the negative association it has with passivity and lack of problem solving. I think it's appropriate to compare psychological brooding with a bird brooding on a clutch of eggs. Although the bird goes through a period of inactivity, this time does eventually serve a purpose. Accepting the role of brooding within my art practice is just a matter of being realistic. There is a human need to turn off your brain sometimes, even if it is a tiny bit maladaptive. The two works I'm about to show on the following slides are exceptional examples of how a sort of one-note creative mode can be successfully used to create an entire successful piece. This is contrary to my process, where I maintain fluidity to shift from mode to mode. I use repetitive mechanical mark making to build up backgrounds of my paintings and then combine this mode with more dynamic, less mechanical modes so that I can shift between different forms of creative expression and emotion as needed. Paul Signac's painting Le Château de Pape is an example of post-impressionistic pointillism, and you can see that classic pointillist technique of building up an entire composition with the exact same small mark. This is calculated and meticulous as it requires pre-planning to place the colors correctly. Building up the effect is worth it. This painting glows in real life from the constant variation in color. At about 20 paces away, all of the small marks blend together and create a luminosity much like even Ayvazovsky's work. That same luminous, almost glowing seafoam green appears in my painting, Biophilia. I spent a lot of time with Château de Pape in person, walking back and forth to observe the changes from near to far distance. Pointillism has this immediacy to it, where up close the hand of the artist is very much visible. And I love that feeling of connection to Signac through his application of paint. It's so easy to imagine him placing each one of these marks. It's my hope for my own work that a viewer is able to connect with my process in the same way and understand a level of my experience making the work. I see this as a wordless, beautiful exchange of human experience. In his book On Writing, Stephen King describes writing as a form of telepathy between writer and reader. I see visual art as the ultimate form of this creative telepathy. For Onoda Minoru, the systematic repetition of dots was a way to think mechanically. He was responding to the industrialization of Japan during the post-war period, in particular his obsession with the vast meaninglessness of machine-made, identically duplicated objects. As I mentioned, the cognitive modes of reflection and brooding are two sides of the same coin. Both can be highly repetitive to the point of potential dysfunction. The crucial difference is that brooding is passive and problem-oriented, whereas reflection is active and solution-oriented. Brooding is more rigid, whereas reflection is more dynamic. In the first two process photos here, you can see the way I use water-based subtractive painting to carve out areas within my composition. This is always an exciting step in my process, because as I work with these colors, they blend in unexpected ways and produce exciting results. This keeps me creatively engaged with the tedious aspects of this type of work. Max Ernst pioneered a process called decalcomania. He would lay thick paint on his canvas and press a plastic sheet on top of it. The result was unpredictable abstract forms. Ernst would then go back into these forms and carve out images he perceived among the abstraction. In this way, he dynamically adjusted paint rather than starting from a completely blank surface. I see a commonality between Ernst's layering of color and detail and my own use of layering color and detail, although we were functioning with different goals. Ernst was a surrealist who wanted to manufacture meaning within the abstracted paint forms, whereas I'm looking to tangibly describe real emotions as abstract plant forms. Wayne Thiebaud's work was his own rumination on consumerism and mass-produced goods. As part of his process, he would stare at his still life objects for an extended amount of time to determine the real quality of his own eyesight. He perceived that when you deeply consider an object and the space around it, you can see a subtle vibrational border of color around the object. He referred to this as halation. The red pops of color in this piece are halation in effect. I consider Thiebaud's process to be dynamic because it involved careful consideration, not mechanical persistence. I contextualize my work against Thiebaud's in terms of the repeating objects and his open desire to access a deeper level of experience beyond daily norms in terms of his own perception of color. I discovered the effect of halation in my process as I added and removed more and more layers of colors. Layers of watercolor pencil can lay on top of each other without blending, and many layers can become hidden underneath each other. When I go back into my painting and subtract out some of these layers, pops of hidden color are revealed underneath. This is visual evidence of my obsessive layering process and the underlying ruminative quality of my workflow. In these examples, you can see how this effect starts to happen naturally, and then I emphasize it more. I see this as a ruminative vibration emanating from these plants, which are in turn symbolic of my emotions. Looking back at my works like Florida 2020 and San Francisco 1993, it's clear to me that I was intentionally illustrating my ruminative spiraling through narrative subject matter. Depicting my figurative self-portraits, staring moodily into the distance, activated the problem-solving part of my mind that loves to draw narrative scenes, but didn't give me any measure of emotional satisfaction. It was the meticulous hatching and building up of textures with mechanical pencil that brought me the satisfaction I was really looking for. But because I worked with essentially the same physical action over and over, there was a hard limit to the benefit of working with mechanical pencil. Staying in one creative mode like that, while also depicting myself within abstracted memories, pushed me towards the depressive end of the ruminative spectrum without me even realizing it. My goal was to avoid depressive processes and focus on deliberate processes, which is the positive end of the ruminative spectrum. Within my process, I define deliberate rumination as the overall creative flow present while making a work. To be in a state of creative, deliberate rumination is to be flexible and to shift between creative modes in response to emotional needs. Whereas I attach brooding and reflection to specific processes and actions, deliberate rumination is more like the overall goal of my practice. In these examples, you can see the flexibility in my new way of working, where I can pick between various mark-making methods depending on my state of mind. Briefly, here are just a few artists whose work is relevant to my own and who I believe created from a place of natural flowing creativity. In Mobius and Dulac's pieces, we see a mix of flowing gestural line work and highly concentrated detail. In Archimboldo's Summer, I want to point out the dense texture of the grass tunic in comparison to the carefully arranged vegetables composing the figure's face. Both of these aspects required a different cognitive mode to engage with. All three of these examples are, from my perspective, well-rounded creative processes, much like the framework I've developed while in this program. When the painter creates a microcosm, a little world that they are able to manipulate and to bring parts of it into existence, one gets much downright pleasure from the experience. Wayne Thiebaud, 1969. I really relate to this quote from Thiebaud. The act of developing my specific processes was so satisfying to me that it completely energized me as a human being. I became obsessed. At the same time, I was reading the science fiction novel Annihilation by Jeff Vandermeer. This story is told from the perspective of a female biologist on an expedition through a dangerous, mysterious natural territory filled with mutated plants and animals. Despite the dangers, this biologist remains fixed on tiny details of the world around her. The entire novel reads like a love letter to plants and natural ecosystems, but also like a love letter to the idea of being happily consumed in your own mental world, much like Thiebaud's quote. I created the Lotus Eater with that idea of being joyfully consumed by a personal inner experience. I consider this painting to be a self-portrait communicating my self-aware obsession and love for my artistic process. You can see the ear and hair framing the face, which is covered in plants. It's not clear if the spiral in the center of the face is moving inward or outward. I wanted to depict a sense of movement different than internal terrarium, where the plants seem to sway as if underwater. In the Lotus Eater, I wanted that sense of movement to visually pull the viewer into the eye of the spiral. In these process photos, you can see some development using the brooding and reflection steps of my creative framework. I had worked on Lotus Eater for almost the entire month of June 2023. At the end of the month, I visited the Tampa Museum of Art, where I discovered Chihuahua Pantera by Firley Baez. I see my Lotus Eater and Chihuahua in visual conversation with one another. Both are faceless, with botanical life erupting out of where the face should be. Both are covered in rich texturing, Chihuahua with full-body fur, and the Lotus Eater with a dense variety of botanical forms. Both speak to this merging of human and botanical, with the result being something that is not quite either. Chihuahua depicts a Dominican mythological creature. So in that regard, we have another parallel, because my lotus eater is directly inspired by quasi-mythological characters from Homer's Odyssey. In the Odyssey, the lotus eaters are obsessed with consuming the lotus plant to the detriment of all else. Anyone who eats the lotus plant will be doomed to forget their responsibilities and their homes and desire only to eat more lotus plant. I've highlighted my use of lotus pods in these detail photos. The pods dominate the composition as they emerge from the face and disrupt the silhouette, much like the palm fronds in Baez's Chihuahua. Kim Jung-gi is another foundational influence from the world of comics and graphic novels. Kim practiced automatic drawing from memory and imagination, and he was prolific with this art form. I see Kim's influence as a trickle-down effect from my earlier works in the program all the way to my Lotus Eater, which is populated with the same type of dense imagery, although executed with a different method. The notion of being obsessed with my artwork to the point of personal detriment has been a running theme in my practice throughout my life. I grew accustomed to squashing down my emotions in order to focus on drawing. I allowed myself to live with severe wrist pain so I didn't have to let go of my love for mechanical pencil drawing. This piece, Executive Dysfunction, is one of my early attempts to depict that overwhelming obsession with my craft. I cut a piece of paper that was my exact height, 5 foot 4 inches, and filled it with automatic drawing from imagination. I wanted to create a sense of an entity occupying this paper that was my same height. The empty space in the center of the composition is meant to be disorienting. My goal was to produce a desire in the viewer for this space to also be filled with drawing. I decided to reinterpret executive dysfunction within the scope of my new body of work. The phrase executive dysfunction refers to an unwanted shutting down of healthy habits and routines during times of emotional stress. The phrase spicy brain has recently circulated online as a lighthearted way to talk about and destigmatize mental health struggles and neurodivergence. After developing my creative framework and understanding the positive impact of my new process on my emotions and mental health, I realized that my mission to communicate my emotions through art had transcended beyond that visual goal. I realized that by developing my own process, I had actually partially changed my own cognition and truly developed a way to live in coexistence with my rumination rather than living in contempt with it. I had finished Jeff Vandermeer's trilogy, beginning with the novel Annihilation and ending with the novel Acceptance. This is a science fiction series in which a small stretch of coastline possesses the ability to mutate anything within its borders. Any humans within the area slowly morph and mutate to become part of the ecosystem. Usually, this means they transform into an animal or a plant. Acceptance concludes the story of the biologist and her own transformation. Because of her consuming love for the natural world and her time within the area observing her surroundings, she undergoes a dramatic mutation and becomes part of the land itself. She slowly transforms into a gigantic landmass the size of a small island, complete with tide pools on her back and plants growing from her new body. Her human brain is still present somewhere inside, but she has been utterly changed. Around this time, I visited the Tate Modern in London and discovered Lee Bull. I immediately connected with her art piece in which she dressed as a mutated creature and performed as a sorrowful, pathetic creature on the streets of Tokyo over the course of 12 days. Lee's overall body of work is expansive and varied, but she consistently makes work with socially critical messaging. I see a connection between the wriggling organic forms of her fabric costumes and the idea of an outer state matching a hidden inner state. Lee dressed herself as a sort of crustacean creature to display her discomfort with the culture of Tokyo. The wriggling, sprouting forms are extensions of that discomfort. Reflecting on ideas of biophilia within my work, I considered the possibility of fusing a classic Ophelia painting with a visualization of biophilia. This idea was twofold. On one hand, I wanted to express my discomfort with the tradition of painting Ophelia as a beautiful woman, despite the fact that this scene does depict her death by drowning. On the other hand, the pun of it all spoke to me. I felt this was an image that had to be made. With this, biophilia was born. My intention was to create an abstracted version of Ophelia, where she is no longer a conventionally beautiful young woman, but instead has become closer to the transformation of the biologist in the novel Acceptance. There is a merging of human and environment that leaves some humanity still visible, but distorts it past the point of true comfort. In this way, I'm also responding to Bull's fabric costumes, which distort the human figure into an organic, mutated creature. Just as Bull's sculptures are covered in wriggling organic forms that seem to convey a sense of emotional discomfort, I wanted to blanket my Ophelia in wriggling forms that impart the same sense of movement I feel when I'm anxious or in deep rumination. Within these forms, I practiced layering glazes to produce a luminous effect, much like the seascape paintings of Ivan Ivazovsky or the Chateau des Papes by Paul Signac. And with that, I conclude my presentation. Thank you all so much. I'd like to open the floor for committee questions, please.
Thank you very much. Do you consider your works infinite or finite?
So, one of the major developments that I've made in this program is that I now finish my works so that they do have a final ending point. My big struggle as an artist has always been finding an end point with my compositions. For instance, with this painting, I worked on it for 4 months. I definitely could have worked on it longer. I like to say that I feel like I could work on a painting forever. I would like to have maybe one piece in my home studio that I do work on forever, but my goal is to be productive. My goal is to make work, finish work, and then to move on to the next piece and get my ideas out. So I don't consider my work to be infinite, especially when you consider that it is made on paper. So one day it will fall apart and deteriorate. But to be quite honest, that doesn't bother me anymore. I fell so in love with that faded print of Steve Lotz's Florida Dream that I am actually curious about what my works will look like when they begin to degrade.
Thank you. Could you please summarize your goal for your audience?
Absolutely. So in speaking to the history of romantic painting, I do want to bring a level of awe and excitement to an ideal audience, but really, I can't control the reaction people have to my work in that way, so I don't count on the fact that people will have that reaction. The baseline experience I would like to have any viewer to have with my work is to just be aware of the tiniest level of detail. I would like any viewer to get as close to the work as possible and to really explore the small details and travel through the piece. I think the large size of the works contributes to people doing that. At the gallery show, I saw a lot of people very, very close. It was exciting for me. So I do plan on continuing to work large scale.
What is your actual navigational process? You go from the neutral or negative emotional state that you talked about into the actual mark making.
Absolutely.
How does marks come about?
Yeah,
from that?
sure. So the brooding state are those mechanical, tight details that are sort of mindlessly repetitive. I mean, there is a level of cognizance required with it, but it's something that you can turn your brain off a little bit more than with more dynamic gestural drawing. When I come into the studio, I try to just sit with myself, feel how I'm feeling, and then I will proceed with actions depending on that. Brooding can look like small circles, or it can look like many flowers, or it can look like some of the mossy texturing we see at the bottom of this piece, or the furry kind of moss that is up towards the top of it. It's any sort of small mark that is just done with the flick of the wrist. I actually really like to compare it to the concept of doom scrolling, which has gotten popular recently. Doom scrolling is when someone becomes stuck in their phone, scrolling forever, looking at bad news or just anything online, until you reach a point of frustration with yourself and your phone, but yet you keep going. So I think that there's this link with small motions that don't require a lot of extra movement and this sort of mechanical, passive mindset in which you will remain unless you maybe go on a walk or something.
So with your background in comics and narrative scenes, can you describe the shift into the compositions and the subjects and how you feel like this work is communicating differently than maybe the works in your background?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the introduction of color was huge for me. I think with a grayscale graphite piece, you can hope that somebody will perceive the same sort of romantic, sublime beauty within it. But there's something to me about a grayscale scene that can zap that quality out of it. I think color is something that people just naturally connect with on an emotive level, like in the fantastic Voyage stills that I showed and all sorts of examples. So working with color was definitely the biggest shift for me, especially because like I say, it's a very dynamic process. So sometimes when I am layering watercolor pencil, I really don't know what the result is going to be. Whereas working this way, I sort of always knew what the result was going to be. It was just a matter of applying more layers to get that full darkness that I was looking for, or carving back into it with an eraser. So there's a very limited amount of modes there. I would say what they have in common, though, is my emphasis on line. The more traditional style of drawing here, but there's still a lot of line work in these paintings. And that comes about when I do the subtractive painting method to remove the paint from the paper. I'll remove the paint so I'll draw the outline first, and then I'll remove the paint with inside the outline, and that leaves the line on the outside. So it might appear that it's been drawn the normal way, but it's actually a much different process, and that involves that playfulness with the color that I mentioned earlier. And as far as connecting into the subject matter of comics, cartoons, and science fiction, especially with this work, I consider this to be more in the realm of background painting. Like I mentioned Studio Ghibli, the animation company, they use gouache paintings as their backgrounds. So there's this really rich history of very carefully rendered gouache paintings that are used as the background of animation that don't have any characters in them. It's an empty scene with just the setting existing as the character itself. I'm very inspired by that, particularly with this cartoon called The Marvelous Misadventures of Flapjack, and then also Chowder, they were out kind of at the same time. Both of the background artists on those shows won daytime Emmys for their work. And they are real studio artists working with traditional watercolor, which are then used as the background of these shows. Thank you.
Would an infinite drawing be healthy?
I think having one would be healthy. I think that if every single one was an infinite drawing, that wouldn't be healthy. I definitely have come to that conclusion in my time in this program. Yeah.
Now that you're guarding your wrist and your health to a greater degree, should you take up etching?
You know, I'm open to experimenting with it. I think that when I first started in this program, I was really insistent on working with mechanical pencil, and that's how the pain with my wrist got so bad. I really pushed the envelope with that one. So that's sort of just a quality about me as a person. I can be kind of rigid. It's why I've enjoyed developing this system, because it really does help me to navigate that rigidity that's kind of a part of my psyche. So now that I have figured out how to make this kind of art and I've moved away from the thing that I was so precious about, I am curious about all sorts of other forms of art. Like I'm more interested in working in sculpture now. I would like to experiment here and there after my time in this program, but working like this will definitely be my primary mode.
Have you reached out to Steve Lotz?
You know, I have tried so hard, Jason. I reached out to Theo, and I reached out to one of the deans here, who is one of my bosses at the student center. She's Steve's neighbor, but she's really busy. I don't even think she saw my email. I would love to speak with Steve in person. I would love to show him my painting or even a photo of my painting and let him know how much I love his work, because it really was a transformational discovery for me. Funnily enough, the first time I saw his painting in person was because I was doing a tour for potential students through my job in the student center. So in combination with that, I kind of feel this like genuine sort of pride for this program. I know that Steve was one of the founding creators of this entire program. So I sort of see that painting as a symbol of UCF in this program for me.
So you briefly mentioned scale with the work and moving forward. Can you talk about scale a little bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. So increasing the scale of my works allows me to put as much tiny detail into it as possible, which I love. But my real motivation in having this scale is to have works that are sort of physically the same size as me. I like to view them, as I said, like an entity or like really an embodiment of part of me. And the paper feeds into that as well, because this paper sometimes has a life of its own. You'll be working with it pinned up on the wall and it'll just come loose. It'll wrap around you like a snake, but the fun part is also that it is such a quality material that it's almost impossible to dent it. So when that happens, originally I would get scared that I was going to hurt my own piece, but now I know that it's pretty much impossible. That's just a funny aside. So I actually would like to work larger. I think that might be a larger project than this, maybe stacking multiple of them. That would probably be something that I would work on for a whole year while also working on other projects. And then on the flip side, I also, just as an aside, I don't really feel drawn to working small anymore. I think probably the smallest size I would work would be like 24 by 36. I probably won't be making small pieces like that anymore unless it's for a friend or a commission.
Are you reading Vandermeer's text in Japanese?
No, those were actually the Chinese covers. I just thought that they were so beautiful compared to the covers that I had read. So, and I liked that they still had the English title on the book, so that it was still identifiable as the book I was talking about. I wish I could speak Chinese or Japanese. That would be great.
Why was biophilia photographed at such an extreme angle and distortion?
So, with all of the other pieces, the wax that I have put over them to finish and seal them, it has a sort of reflective quality. It didn't interfere with the photos of the other pieces, but with this one in particular, I think because of the darkness of that top part of the painting, the wax became very shiny, and I couldn't find another way to photograph it to reduce that shininess. So that was my best option.
So you talked about uncovering misogynistic practices in the sciences, and I know that you have incorporated some imagery relating to that specific story that you gave us. Is there anything else that is in your work that references those kinds of practices that you've uncovered?
You know, my goal with this imagery is to sort of be subtle about my own thinking, not because I don't enjoy talking about this to people, because I really do, but because I'm not trying to create that type of extremely loaded image just because it can tend to put me into a bad mood. if I'm thinking about these sort of huge concepts, it's definitely part of rumination for me, is that I just have to take a step back and remind myself that I'm just one person. I don't have control over huge mechanics of the world. To that end, I'm really interested in collaborating with people in the future. I'm not even sure what that would look like, but I'm interested in working with all different types of artists and just sort of finding a fusion of our different approaches and subject matters. So I'd be very interested with working with other people who tackle these subjects directly head on and sort of encouraging and supporting these ideas. But in my own work, I really like to bury the lead a little bit.
Your current relationship to depression?
You know, I don't really experience depression anymore. I think I did when I was younger. Mostly I struggle with hyperactivity, and I think that throughout my life, not understanding that I was hyperactive, I thought that I was anxious. So because I didn't have a way to acknowledge and deal with that within myself, that can lead to freezing in the moment in your life, and then that leads to depression. So looking back through the whole timeline of my mental health, I think the issues that I was having were always centered around the sort of hyperactive feeling inside my body, and that's the same feeling that I'm connecting with these various types of mark making. So, you know, in a way, this brooding gesture of filling up a large space, you might imagine that I do it slowly, and sometimes I probably do, but often it's very quick, and it's a way to express that sort of circulating energy inside myself.
So, in addition to what you mentioned about scale and potentially collaborating, what do you see as the next steps for your work?
You know, I have a large piece that I'm working on for the end of this semester for the final critique. It'll be the largest of these paintings yet. It's about double the size of, or maybe 75% bigger than the largest one. As far as collaborating, I'd be really interested in something that layers work inside of an installation environment. So I'd be really interested in making background scenery, which could then have a whole other scene in front of it. I'd also be interested in making like paper objects in the same style as my work, just cutouts that can be made into a scene. Thank you.
Thank you, Olivia. This concludes questions from the committee. It's time to open up to questions from the audience, and a kind reminder again, questions only, please.
Hey, first of all, phenomenal presentation, phenomenal work.
Thank you.
You talked about letting yourself feel the emotions as you make the work and letting that determine the kind of mark making you do. Specifically, when you're feeling negative emotions, kind of doing that ritualistic, repetitive process. Do you find that was a way to assist you in climbing out of those negative emotions, or do you find more value in being able to live with them in the moment and just kind of let them guide you where they go?
Yeah, that's a great question. So really, the guiding metric of it all is just my desire to be productive against all odds. I mean, I will let myself have a day every now and then, but I'm at this point in my life, in my early 30s, where I actually, it's hard for me to take a day to just do nothing. I genuinely feel really bad when I do that. I'll start thinking about all of the mistakes I've made in my life, you know, just like this swirling, spiraling nonsense. And all of that goes away if I just stay productive. Idle hands do the devil's work, sort of thing. So the side effect, I never thought that the side effect of making this work and understanding my process like this would be that I feel better. Isn't that funny? But that is the side effect. So it's wonderful. But that wasn't my original goal. So I feel, that's why some of this research about the sublime, sublimation, that's why I felt like it was very important to share that context, because this entire process, learning experience, was very surprising to me, the level that it took my mind. Like, the anxiety that I had at the beginning of this program, which was not caused by the program, but by my greater life. So my greater life is still the same, my past is still the same, but the way that I think about it and feel about it is so different now. I hope that answers your question.
So beautiful work, of course. I'm really interested in your connection to media. A lot of the media that sort of subconsciously with your work, you can consciously seem to be from your past, and sort of brought in that nostalgia.
Yeah.
With Annihilation sort of being that like almost like modern contemporary village you had some best with your work. Do you see? I don't want to say inspired. Do you see yourself being inspired by media or having influence consciously in the future more like things that come out like
Yeah.
or sort of more modern?
Absolutely, yes. So I view media like TV and film. I really don't mentally categorize that as separate from art. I know that all of these forms of art are unique and separate, but within the overall world of art, I see a television show as being made by a whole team of dozens of studio artists who are combining their work together to make this beautiful thing. And when a movie is good, it's really good. When a TV show is good, it's really good. But I wouldn't say that either of those forms of art is like my default, especially as I've gotten older and accepted that I'm a hyperactive person. Like I said, it's hard for me to just kind of sit still for a day. It's hard for me to even go watch a movie that I really want to see. I kind of have to trick myself into doing it. Like I will go see Dune 2 tonight, but I will have to trick myself into just sitting still the whole time. But I also feel that I have been really transformed by beautiful, creative TV and movies. So I will never discount that from the creative lexicon that I draw from.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. I only met you last year, and at the time you were you were still talking about your experience of having raised a raven and how significant that was in your life and how you wanted to incorporate that in your work. And so when I see this amazing work here, and I'm like, where is the raven? Where is this very important entity for you?
Yeah.
And so, and I know that we all evolve as we go through this process. So I'm wondering, how did you deal with, speaking of acceptance,
Yeah.
what was your inner working like when you were like, okay, I need to move on from this, I'm discovering something new. What did you experience in that process?
Sure. So this definitely connects back to the idea of depression and a depressive state. The combination of working with the graphite, as I've described, in this very rigid way that resulted in legitimate physical pain, combined with the thing that makes me the most sad in life, that was a terrible combination. So that's why I stopped depicting Morpheus and I started moving towards more natural scenes, because in my desire to stay productive, that seemed like the logical choice. Why would I continue making art that I felt was destabilizing me? But I actually think about this all the time because I really do want to make work about him in the future. Something about, besides the rigidity and the physical pain, something about depicting him in this way felt a little bit trivial. It felt a little bit like just an illustration in an Edgar Allan Poe book, in a bad way, because it's my life and it's this animal that I really cared about. So I didn't want to draw that comparison between something so precious to me and something which is sort of a staple of pop culture, which is a raven done in grayscale, black and white, creepy, with this sort of Edward Gorey style. I was very hyper-conscious of that. It felt almost like a slap in the face to me. So now that I know how to work in a way that is so much more satisfying to me, I do sometimes think about the compositions that I'm going to make of him, but I'm still really interested in landscapes and botanical detail. So I'm not sure if they will really be compositions about my exact bird or just the love that I have for ravens as a species, which is huge. The funny thing about having any type of animal, I think, is that when you meet another of that animal, sometimes it feels like you're meeting your old friend. Like just yesterday, I saw a dog that looked just like my old dog from high school. They were twins. So whenever I have the privilege to encounter a raven out in the world, which they're not in Florida, so it doesn't happen here, I really do feel like I'm just connecting with an old friend. So I do find it like emotionally genuine to continue depicting them. Thank you for asking about that.
Do you find that the process of sealing your work with the wax and sort of repetitive emotion is an extension of the neutral or negative emotion, or do you find it sort of a different sort of thing?
That's a great question, because I actually didn't talk about the process that goes into sealing the paintings. So I'm glad you brought that up. It's perfect. At first, I tried putting the wax on with sort of like a paper towel or a linen cloth, but then I realized the best way to do it is to put on gloves and apply it with your hand. So the Dorland's wax medium does not smudge watercolor pencil at all. Even when heated, I did all of these crazy tests on it, and it's almost impossible to smudge with the Dorland's wax medium. So these big motions of applying the wax to the paper honestly feel completely different than any of the other modes, because it's not really a creative process. It's more like a construction process, you know? It feels like I'm putting the last coat of paint on the outside of a house or something. It feels very technical, but not that brooding type of mechanical feeling. Also because the wax is so smooth that it's this very, very fluid motion. It's extremely fun. I can't wait to do it again. Thank you.
Where did you learn how to archive with wax? I've never heard of that.
You know, I was just Googling, and I was a little bit desperate. I was going through all of these different mediums, and I found Dorland's wax medium, and I searched all of these other sources for it. I tested it out on a less important piece before I put it on my important ones, and I'm really impressed by the way that it works. Yeah.
Did you test it for longevity?
Well, to be honest with you, yeah, no, it is archival. The only thing about it, which is actually a positive for me, is that unlike some other fixatives or sealants, which can be removed if you wanted to remove them, this wax cannot be removed. It's stuck to the piece. So it is archival. It's a real art material, but once it's on, it's on. And I consider that a plus for me because I don't want the temptation of removing it and going back into my works. I do feel like I would do that.
That makes them.
Yeah, exactly. It's done.
Well, that's a very interesting thing, when that finishes
Yeah.
your opportunity.
Exactly.
You can go.
Yeah, except for on the back side. I could always go on the back.
No.
Thank you.
In a perfect world, how would you frame this? We talked about it the other night.
Yeah.
The good.
You know, I always think about my ideal frame in terms of a collaboration with a real framing artist who does carving and who takes that art form to the final conclusion of it. I would love to. I'm very social. I love collaborating with people, and I also have no interest at all in carving wood and making my own frame. I'm very happy with pencil and brush. But I actually really love this presentation. I think that in an ideal situation, in a fantasy world, there would be some kind of alcove system where maybe they would be set back into an alcove and then they would still be floated within that space so that they would stand on their own, but just, you know, sort of this little cave for it. I'm a big fan of this type of presentation because I really like to see the edges and the sides of the paper. Yeah. Also, I'm really interested in displaying my work outside without a frame. Haven't begun looking into that at all, but it's just an idea I have to sort of suspend them in nature and to take photos of them just for a moment, not to leave them there, just to see what that would look like. The wax does melt. That's the thing about it. That's the negative thing about it. If it gets above, you can't leave it in a hot car. That's about it. Yeah. So, Florida.
It's very brave of you, after spending so much time on these pieces, for you to cover them with the wax. It's really, because obviously they take hours and hours and hours and hours, and this method that you're talking about, filling time and space and your thoughts.
Thank you.
Yeah, very well thought out. Which is your favorite?
So hard to pick. It's like picking a favorite child. That one's my favorite.
Do you know why? Do you know why? Can you describe it?
Yeah, well, I worked on it for 4 months, so I worked on it for 3 months longer than all the other color pieces were a month long, and this one was a 2-month-long project. So what I love about this one is that the way it started and every phase of it, you would never have guessed how it ended turning up. And I had no idea either, so it was this really genuine process of discovery, and it just felt like, you know, I explained about the terrarium. It really did feel like I was getting in touch with a part of myself that was latent and waiting there. And in the beginning, it wasn't as fun. But then towards probably like the middle of the second month, it started to get really, really fun.
Christy, were you in it for over a year? You mean starting and stopping it? Because I saw this a year ago at the beginning, didn't it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And you're right, it has evolved so much.
Mm-hmm. I worked on it so much in the spring 2023 semester that I definitely felt like the eyes of judgment from everybody, because I had worked on it for so long that it was like, what are you doing? Yeah, it was worth it. Alex?
Can you talk about the role humor and sexuality plays in your work? Because there's some spicy secrets in some of them.
Some of them, yeah. So going back to that quote by Kant, where he's talking about how even botanists don't pay attention to the reproductive functions of flowers. I love that quote, and I think that it's philosophically appropriate and interesting, but I also think that Kant lived a long time ago. And I think in this current era, most people are aware that some plants look like something else. It's very much on the table and circulating, you know, in public thought. So also with the connection of Venus flytraps to the original botanists who named them after women's genitalia, I feel like that just opens the door. So if you've seen carnivorous plants in real life, they have this glossiness to them that is, as you'd say, a little bit spicy, a little bit erotic, and then also the forms of them, you know, they've got open holes, they've got sort of curves and a weight to them. So I like that cheeky quality of plants. And I'm not offended by the fact that the botanists named the Venus flytrap after women's genitalia, because there are many plants that are named after human body parts and genitals. It's more about that the joking and the teasing and the fact that these letters are recorded in history. I find that really embarrassing for them, and then also just for the world. You know, it didn't have to be that way. So actually, your question, I really want to ride that line between a little bit shocking imagery, but also something that just fits in with sort of the aesthetic of like Pandora at Disney World. That's a great example. These public conceptions of botany and plants that to me are so blatantly sexual, you know, but it's much like Kant said, people like connecting with plants in that way because it allows them to access these kind of taboo topics, but it's a plant, you know, they just grow that way. So really there's nothing taboo about it at all. Thanks for your question.
I know that you were working on a comic autobiography. So how is that going in a graphic autobiography? How is that going, and when do you project for it to be done?
Oh, so that was my idea for a big thesis project in the beginning of my time in this program. I love comics. I am better at writing comics than I am at creating them, because the truth about comics, as Matt knows, is that it is an obsessional craft that you have to devote as much time and more as I have on these paintings, but then also a lot of it is contained within a computer, because you have to adjust all these files as you prepare them. I learned all of these things during my time in my undergrad, but I'm not really interested in working on a computer, and I'm interested in writing comics, but I think that like intense rigidity of the comic book creation process, that's another thing I would have to have a collaborator for. I can't do that by myself. Because in my view, creating is supposed to be fun. It's supposed to fuel you, and it's supposed to make you feel energized, like how I've described in this presentation. It's not supposed to be something that you get so easily frustrated with that you just want to throw in the towel, which is how I feel when I work on a computer. Mm-hmm. Doing anything, not just art. Yeah.
Dear friends, please join me in congratulating Olivia.